All right, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Isaac Sacolick. Again, I will be your moderator today for a great discussion on SRE and service level objectives, 5 ways to deliver exceptional service. We have 2 veterans in the software industry joining on my panel today. First up, joining me is Kit Merker. Kit Merker is the Chief Operating Officer from Noble9. He's gone from coding to an engineering manager to an evangelist, and now product manager. He's been with JFrog, Google Cloud, and Microsoft, and he got his chops working on Kubernetes. Hello, Kit. Say hello to everybody.
Hey, Isaac. Hey, everybody. Nice to be here.
Thanks, Kit. And also joining me today is Thad West. He's the CEO of ISOS Technology. He's got expertise in finance, health services, insurance, construction, and retail technologies. Hello, Thad. It's great to be back with you on a panel.
Isaac, always good to talk to you. Thank you.
Again, thanks for everybody. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. First, please use the questions in the question box to ask us questions. We're going to be going through those toward the end of today's panel. But again, I've got 2 experts on the topic of SREs and DevOps and Agile. And so we're going to do very best to leave some time at the end to answer your questions. And second thing is the slides and access to this recording will be sent to you after the recording is complete. So let's get started, guys. Kit, Thad, I want to make sure everybody here knows a little bit about your companies before we get started. So Kit, what is Noble9? What can you tell everybody in a few seconds?
Noble9 is a service level objective platform. We let you set up service level objectives, SLOs, and error budgets without retooling all of your monitoring and without having to do any math.
Great, thanks, Kit. And Thad, a little bit about ISOS Technology.
Yeah, I'll start off with a bold statement. We're helping the organizations that are changing the world. So we work with their teams on their processes and tools so they can work more effectively and efficiently. That way they can really focus on their business problems with no distractions. We're the specialists who step in and make everything hum, and we do that with our really great software partners from Atlassian, AWS, and Noble9.
Super. Guys, I'm really happy to be here with you guys because, it's not often I get to have a conversation with experts around a field that's been changing so much over the last decade. But, Kit, I want to start with you. We've been talking about DevOps, about the tools around DevOps like CI/CD and infrastructure as code, the collaboration that DevOps bring, and being able to move fast through an agile development process, but also make sure that our applications are robust and running well in operating modes. And then, Google comes out with the concept of an SRE. Tell us, from your perspective, how does the SRE fit into this operating model?
Well, yeah, thanks, Isaac. So the interesting thing with reliability engineering or site reliability engineering is it's really a partnership role with the dev teams. We're seeing more and more you build it, you run it kinds of mentality. So you build software, you're responsible for running it. And SREs can really help with improving specific reliability targets, infrastructure improvements, kind of making things more sustainable, making it not just sort of like, reliable as possible, but actually setting a specific target and giving the team the appropriate level of reliability. And the reason why this is important is because overbuilding the reliability of a service is very expensive, prohibitively expensive. And so when you think about, the kind of traditional model, developers and operators is really a question of who's carrying the pager, who's responding to incidents. In the SRE model, we really move into incident defense instead of incident response. And the way that that's done is by really kind of finding the right balance point between the important decisions, right? So instead of fighting over reliability versus features, it's really about using our quote unquote error budget, which is really the gap of reliability available to us to decide the right thing to do for customers, whether that's working on features or technical debt. And so this evolution has really made the SRE model really about bridging the gap between development and really the business stakeholders.
Kit, I love this concept of an incident defense that, working with lots of different companies, you're seeing some that are cloud native, some that are trying to modernize applications, others, have a strong, ITSM need. They're servicing a lot of applications that they bought, but essentially, they're all in this space of trying to get their developers and operators to collaborate and make sure that applications are running reliable. Can you share a couple of examples of your clients anonymously that are going through this journey together?
Sure, absolutely. That's one of the great things is we see a lot of companies on various trajectories in their DevOps and their reliability discussions. So, the first company that comes to mind is it's a large scale software solution in a heavily regulated industry. And they're very early in their DevOps journey. So some of their challenges is they have a very large code base. There are many teams contributing to the release of this monolithic software. And because they only have a couple point releases a year, it adds extra challenge. So when we think about DevOps, we always think, hey, the CI/CD pipeline, and it's going to go really quickly. But for these guys, it's 1 or 2 point releases a year. So, early on in their journey, where we're starting with them is we're starting with the dev team. So, hey, we have a lot of different teams that are contributing to this release. Let's understand that, and let's make sure that we're standardizing in our branching model and our release process across the team. Let's bring in ops early. So they're investing in DevOps engineers and embedding them in development teams, which I think is fantastic. So no more throwing over the wall and just saying ops, make it work, make it scale. It's really, starting to build that partnership. And then they're starting to scratch some of the surfaces of what we would consider in that kind of site reliability engineering spaces. They're creating infrastructure as code. So now environmental changes are part of change management and really starting to think about how to develop and deploy that discipline. They want to start thinking about building reliability in, so really investing in developing a much larger suite of automated tests. And then finally, we are Atlassian partners, and we're helping them to make Jira as a source of truth for all development, build, and deploy activities. Not that it has to do all of these activities, but it really is the orchestrator. So that's one example of a customer that's pretty early on in their life cycle of DevOps, but you can start to bring in those reliability concepts early. Another customer example is one that we're working with Kit. They're a large retail organization and they have a much more mature DevOps organization. And I'd say that where they're at is they have great processes on what I'd call the bookends of DevOps. So build and deploy works really well for them. Incident response works really well for them. But starting to drill into that meaty middle, which is where we're starting to have some real conversations about reliability. So refocus on building reliability in the processes. So how do we think about making reliability part of our build process and part of our code base? We start to bring in the product teams in discussion in a meaningful way. So that's where the SRE, the SLO conversation really helps out is really let's talk about what reliability means from an SLO perspective. And it's really about, I think, Kit, you touched on it in your response. It's, creating a culture of 100% reliability is not possible. It's not financially responsible to even try to achieve it. And it's really not the best use of company resources. So technology understands that, and they're starting to bring that into the business. And the other cool point is it's not just about customer facing products. It's a discipline that they want to build across their internal facing tools. About everything that they support, reliability and how we spend our budgets and our errors is really something that we want to do organizational wide, not just an outward facing projection of what our customers see.
That I love this response because you're just illustrating the continuum and the evolution. It's not something that organizations are going to adopt in one shot. There's a lot of different disciplines to it. It takes time to instrument, but it's really about trying to get the culture and the alignment there. And to that end, Kit, you've done this in a number of organizations. You've seen it large and small. Where does that SRE skill set fit organizationally? Is it in the dev organization? Is it in the ops organization, or is it sitting somewhere in between those two?
I mean, from an organizational perspective, the SRE or reliability engineers, production engineers, et cetera, are generally considered part of an ops group, and they can be supporting apps developed in-house. They can be supporting third-party applications or sort of IT deployed applications, open source applications, et cetera. The thing that really differentiates them is that they have the software engineering mindset and tool set. And so what you're really talking about is an operator responsibility but with the skill set to go and eradicate things with code and to automate themselves out of a job. There's a really strong collaboration between SREs and app developers in particular when you're trying to rapidly iterate on code and not break things. This is becoming much more prevalent to have this really shared relationship and a high ratio of app developers to SREs. In the public cloud, if you think about it, right, a lot of these SaaS services and public cloud services we're relying on now, they're part of your SRE team. And a lot of your reliability, where yesterday, may have been, your data centers and your operators, now you're actually relying on third parties a lot. And so the service boundaries, right, everything is as a service. And so the question becomes, how do you define the service levels you expect? And this is where the SLOs come in, which is one of the key tools in the toolbox for SREs to be able to know what to build and how to engineer reliable solutions.
Kit, that's some really good advice, and that really leads to really our first example of a takeaway for everybody here. I think, Agile's been around for 20 years or so. DevOps has been around for a decade. SRE is relatively new as a function, and making sure that as you're adding that skill set and that function, you want to get into incident defense. You want to start layering in some of the capabilities you heard Kit and Thad talk about, really making sure that the organization understands the charter and the role of the SRE, regardless of where they're sitting, regardless of where they fit into the organizational model. But let's dive into this some more a little bit. I want to make sure that we do a little bit of level setting. So I want to do some rapid fire definitions around some of the things people on this webinar are hearing out or reading about, and making sure we can give our sense of what their definitions are. So, SREs is really not something new. It's really an implementation of a DevOps program. I think that's probably the best definition of it. And, Thad, I've heard this broken down into a few functions. First is, DevOps has a principle of reducing organizational silos, specifically between dev and operations. And for SREs, what that really means is using the same tools that the developers are using and vice versa. What does that mean in practice to you?
Yeah, no, I love it. Honestly, SREs are working in the same tools as devs. And so when you think about it, from our perspective, that center of that universe becomes the Atlassian tool set. So Jira Software is where requirements are happening, where we're talking about the process of what we're building. And then you talk about the feedback from customers and from the field, and that's Jira Service Management for ITSM tools. So the Atlassian tools are used for the orchestration, and your SRE teams, your DevOps teams, your program teams are all working in the same tools, which is pretty powerful.
Super. Moving on, gradual changes, right? That's a big DevOps principles, and SREs are trying to do that by reducing the cost of failure. What's an example of that?
Yeah, I love it. I love the phrase speed with guardrails. So build in reliability, being able to deploy when you need, but from that SRE discipline, let's be able to measure the impact to customers and operations. Not all incidents are equal, and hey, if we're tracking well on our air budget, we're not all rattling the pager and waking everybody up. So.
Right. And then the last example for you, Thad, is tools for automating, right? Big principle of DevOps, and SREs really focused on looking at the toil that our developers and our operators are doing and trying to shrink that down with automation. What's an example of that?
I love it. And the concept of automation is one that's going to come up a lot. Automation is where reliability starts because you don't have a human doing it. But, it really allows devs to focus on customer business benefits. What's their value proposition? On the operations side, they can focus on reliability, performance. So with that SRE, they're in there removing the focus and have their focus on removing end-to-end toil. So it's really about having all of that lumped into one and not separate disciplines, but really thinking about it holistically.
Super. Hey, Kit, I'm going to start with you on a definition around service level objectives. I want to start there. What does that mean to you?
Well, everybody's familiar with service level agreements, and the service level objective is kind of a different way of thinking about this, which is it's really a reliability goal. I actually like to think of it as an unreliability goal because as important as it is to define, how many nines of uptime you want, it's also important to define, how much unreliability we can get away with before customers will leave our service and choose someone else. And this, to me, is a very almost dirty question, but it's an important question for a business because we want to gain the confidence and deliver excellence with our customers. But at the same time, we have a business to run and we want to do that sustainably. So SLOs are a proportion of events, pass versus fail, that sets a goal that defines sort of user happiness and thriving business in terms of the reliability that they're trying to achieve.
Right. I think a key point there is really measuring it against events. And it's really trying to define how much unreliable you can manage. So then what's an error budget? You mentioned that earlier already.
Yeah, an error budget is the inverse of an SLO. So if you say 100% minus an SLO of say 3 nines, 99.9, the remaining 0.1% is your error budget. And this is a term that I think Google coined, has become a very popular concept in the SRE kind of parlance. But the cool thing about error budget, why is it a budget? It's a budget because we can spend it, and we spend it to serve customers. And if we blow our error budget dealing with outages and incidents, we have less remaining to spend on new features and testing and production. And so this becomes a natural way for everybody in the organization to invest their error budget toward value for customers. And when you blow the error budget, you focus on reliability. If you have error budget left over, you can move faster. And that's kind of how error budgets are used in practice.
Yeah, I love it, Kit, because we're now starting to quantify something that's just conceptual in nature, but it gives the team a tool for being able to measure things and make decisions off of it. One more, what is Git Ops? I saw it on the Noble 9 website, so maybe you can help me with that one.
I believe Git Ops was actually coined by Alexis Richardson from Weaveworks, and the term refers to a set of practices all centered around infrastructure as code and following CI/CD. And so the kind of the principle here is that the truth is in our code. The way, like in SLOs, for example, imagine if you could define those in a declarative syntax and check them in, and then every time that the updates happen, they could be pull requested, copy pasted, reviewed, run through CI/CD. That's a way that everything in your environment is there. So GitOps is really about infrastructure. It's about configuration. It's about secrets management. It's about every update to your production environment flowing through a consistent pathway that starts at Git, at source control.
Super. That takes us to our second takeaway, and it's really about defining service level objectives, looking at it and articulating them differently than maybe a single number like 4 or 5 nines when we used to think about service level agreements, and now starting to think about it in terms of business context. Maybe it's time of day, maybe it's region, maybe it's for a specific type of action on your website. So it creates a very different dialogue around how to create them, and also more importantly, how to manage them. Now, Kit, when you and I talked, you had some really good examples of how leaders should open up that dialogue and have that conversation, right? It's always been a very difficult question for people in operations to go back to a stakeholder and say, what is your service level agreement? How does service level objectives change that conversation and make it a little bit more business specific?
Yeah, so I think there's a bunch of misconceptions about the way we talk about reliability in an organization. And I've already alluded to this important question, which is how much unreliability can we get away with? And I think of the difference between excellence and perfection, okay? If I can provide an excellent service and slightly overachieve everyone else's expectations, I can do better than my competitors. I could be running a fantastic business, but the gap from that to perfection is still staggering. And so trying to achieve 100% reliability as a business leader, if I say I want 100% reliability, 200% security, and 300% more features than anybody else, my engineering team is going to flip the bid on me, and because they can't engineer to that, and they're going to make up their own definition of what a reliable system means. Okay, and so the first question is, where will customers break away? When will they become disappointed with us and switch to a competitor? And at what point can we justify the cost of avoiding that? By finding that perfect point, what I sometimes refer to as the edge of excellence in a business. We can find that point and define it as an SLO that can be measured. We can make really important automated and business decisions about how we engineer our solution. Okay, if you can find that point, that is really critical. Now, you were alluding to the fact that businesses don't run all the time, and I've changed my thinking on average cost of downtime. I used to believe, oh, we'll just figure out an average cost of downtime number and multiply all our investments by that, and bada bing, bada boom, you have a engineering budget. It doesn't work that way. Businesses are seasonal. Different times of day matter. If you imagine a commerce website and you've got clicks of people browsing the catalog versus placing an order, you've got two very different types of transactions with different volumes and different values. By breaking those apart into separate SLOs, you can start to understand behavior, and you can define different goals depending on that. And this applies to Black Friday. If you're a retailer, or the holiday season more generally, it could apply to the stock market being open or closed if you're a financial services company. It could apply to when you launch a new TV show if you're a streamer. So these different industries have seasonality. How do we encode that into the logic of our reliability system? And this is where SLOs really get rich and powerful, because now you have KPIs and decision points that you can engineer against that are encoding those business rules and really driving that conversation between the business and technical stakeholders. That's really the big idea.
That's super. Now, Thad, that answer from Kit was very application oriented. Let's shift into the world of ITSM, and you're implementing service levels inside Jira Service Manager. We want this notion of excellence versus perfection when we're talking about requests and incidents. How is that implemented from a JSM ITSM perspective?
No, it's a great question. And, one of the things Kit brought up, I think Kit used the term edge of excellence. I love that term. Sounds like a song from the 80s, but I still love it. That's maybe why I love it. But, maybe another term to throw around of minimum viable excellence, so MVE. So thinking about same concept, right? And as soon as we define what that minimum viable excellence is, and we start managing to that, we start to move from reactive ticket-based to proactive. Let's talk about defining new capabilities and implementing new services. So really, in the ITSM world, we do have SLAs. SLAs are very easily defined across a lot of tools, but let's think about those SLAs as really contractual agreements. Those SLAs typically aren't driven by customer demands, customer requirements. They're really, I'd almost say that it's a trap of arbitrary numbers and metrics. So when you start to think about these things, SLAs are important from a contractual point of view, but really, bringing in the conversation of SLO, that matters in ITSM as well, because exactly what you guys were talking about, it brings in the context of business impact, time of day, seasonality, how the customers are impacted, and what's their threshold for that impact. So I think it carries itself nice and neatly into ITSM, and I think I don't think it's a dev-only concept for sure.
And Kit, very quickly, how granular should we make these SLOs?
As granular as possible, but no more granular is probably my best answer there. It's so funny. We have so many different services now. And when you use SLOs to rationalize the customer interactions in the business, and when I say customer, you could mean users and other service boundaries. But there's cloud services and third-party services you're using. You want to model those service boundaries as SLOs and understand what matters. And so finding the smallest number of high-quality SLOs, which is a continual process, you're always on that journey together, that's what's going to give you a super high signal-to-noise ratio and let you focus in. And then when it trips the wire, then you still need all the other data to go debug. But getting that small set, it's almost like KPIs. There's a small set of KPIs you want to focus on. SLOs can be thought of kind of the same way.
Super. So that brings us to our third takeaway for today. And thinking about realigning operations, we're measuring to events, we're capturing error budgets, we're using even burn downs to measure those things. It's a different mindset in terms of managing to the SLOs and a different set of metrics that we're capturing against that. And so, Kit, I want to move on to this point around this concept of an unreliability a budget, or how much unreliability can I get away with? It's a really interesting question, because my knee-jerk reaction is to say none. So how does this actually happen in practice?
Yeah, well, I think the knee-jerk reaction, I think, is coming from years of trying to do the best we can and to hope for the best. And I think hope is not a strategy here. So we want to be more quantified than that. And I really do like this minimum viable reliability concept, or error we can talk about. The
minimal viability excellence. What did you say?
MVE. It's excellence. I was trying to figure what the E was. It's excellence.
Yeah.
Minimal viable excellence. A mouthful. Well, if you want to define a great service, and I think of even in the human world, sometimes with software, I think we get overtrained. So you walk into a grocery store, for example, right, and you want to buy a product. And do they have the product you want, or do they have some alternative you can pick instead? Is it the price you expected online, or is it a slightly different price? You know, if it's a little bit more, how much more would it have to be for you to leave? And if you go to checkout, you know, is there 3 people ahead of you in line? Is there 100 people ahead of you in line? Depending on those scenarios, you're going to choose whether or not to do business with this store. And we're in the exact same situation when we model our business. And by the way, SLOs are for business. This is not for, you know, charity or whatever. Like we're trying to run a business here. Reliability is fundamentally a business concept. We're trying to do something here that's about delivering this service for customers. So when we see that as a human in a retail situation, you know, we make a decision about whether we want to continue doing business or not. And when somebody comes to your website, your mobile app, or your API, they're going to make similar decisions about whether they want to continue doing business with you. And so if you can understand what that is, this is where the error budget comes in, because you're basically saying, what tolerance does our customer base have to retry or wait, or to, you know, kind of give us a pass on this one, and how can we make it right for them so that it doesn't recur and it's very rare, and it doesn't really get in the way of delivering the service. And there's all kinds of design considerations that can be put in place from downstream systems about retry logic and resiliency. We see this all the time, graceful degradations of service, et cetera. And the benefit to the company, for us, right? Like, let's be selfish for a second, is I don't have to wake up at 3 in the morning to answer a page when really nobody's using the service, or if they were, what happened was transient. And by moving to this SLO-based model and really paying attention to the SLOs, there's a bunch of techniques that reduce that noise. This is really important, because that sort of permission to ignore is grounded in the fact that we define the SLOs with business stakeholders based on what actually drives user and customer behavior. Without that basis, right, we're being irresponsible. But by having that foundation, we can be really smart about what risks are worth taking and which ones are not. And so building that kind of rigor into the process from your infrastructure, from your use cases, user stories, adding the metrics to it, adding specific goals, refining them over time, and then reframing your incident management, incident defense around supporting the customer's goals and outcomes for this thriving business we're trying to build. This is really what it comes down to. So when you're trying to just drive reliability, I think often in this reliability engineering conversation, everybody assumes we're trying to improve reliability. And that's just simply not the case. In fact, one of the things I talk to most companies about is, where can we reduce our reliability goals in a smart way, so we can refocus our energy on the single use case that really matters, right? Like whether that's swiping a credit card or you know, making a purchase, or something else that really requires high levels of reliability. Let's open up ourselves to reduce reliability for the less important use cases.
This is great. Thanks to everybody who's starting to put questions into the question box. I promise we will get to your questions at the end, so don't leave them aside. But Thad, I'm really having a problem with this. I'm looking at all the people on this webinar, and they're going to go to their CEOs and to their general managers, and they're going to say, how much unreliability can I get away with? And I have this picture of them looking at me with pitchforks and torches coming at me and saying, what are you, crazy? So how do they have this dialogue with their stakeholders without them looking at them, they're from a different planet, and actually getting to the right answer around getting to something that's manageable?
No, I mean, that's a great question. I think Kit alluded to it earlier. 100% reliability is what we're shooting for, and really it just doesn't make sense. Kit, I want to latch on to something you just said about reframing your incident management process. I mean, that's really what we're trying to do, and reframing it in a new context. And so how do you have that conversation? Well, it starts with a conversation around prioritization, which goes hand in hand in risk. So, part of that is, hey, 5 nines sounds great, but can become a drag on innovation. So if we're going to spend 85, 95% of our resource time building to 5 nines, is that pay off? So that's a first way to approach it, is what's the value of getting to this uber level of reliability? And then the second piece is, we're already doing this implicitly in organizations. So think about it. If system A goes down and system B goes down at the same time, somebody in the organization is going to say, hey, let's get system A up, and then we'll get system B up, right? There is already some sort of prioritization happening in the organization today, and it's happening implicitly. This is really about bringing an open and transparent discussion to the group. Let's talk through it. Let's get to more meaningful goals, and let's also make better decisions. So much of this is happening implicitly in our orgs today. Let's just bring it out and have a conversation about it. So I think there's a couple different tacks. There's the financial budget tack. There's the cost of innovation. There's, hey, we're already making these decisions today. Let's get it down on paper and let's make better decisions and figure out why we would prioritize system A over system B.
Better than getting it on paper, let's get it into the code.
Let's get it into the code. I love that. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, my Agile brain is we're going to put sticky notes everywhere and do it that way. Yeah.
Oh boy, Thad, we're not going back to sticky notes. That really brings us to our fourth takeaway around this. We're shifting not only the tools that we're using, we're also shifting our mindset and talking about experiences and using decisions based on our error budgets, a new way of thinking about how to think about incidents, but not just saying, taking an incident and, what's the mean time to resolve it and how do we reduce incidents, but bring that back into the entire development process and being able to say how we're managing to that error budget, but also how we're managing the development process against that. So, Kit, you had some great examples when we talked about SLOs and the difference with SLAs. Now let's talk about this error budget and how do we manage it? How do we put it to use?
Sure thing. The error budget, the classical example of it is where people talk about feature versus technical debt decision making. But there's actually a more exciting use case, I think, which is about incident prevention and kind of incident prediction. And if you think about this budget, okay, I want to give you a real life example to try to illustrate the power. So my wife gives me a $10 a day budget for lunch. And so as long as I spend less than $10 a day, she leaves me alone. But one fine day, I take Thad out to lunch and I'm going to probably spend like $30 taking him to lunch. And then I take Isaac out to lunch and we spend $70 on lunch. My wife doesn't have to wait to the end of the month to call me up and say, hey, Kit, you're running out of money for lunch, right? Well, we have the exact same system with error budgets. If we have a threshold, right, we say 99.9%, for example, of errors, as long as we stay below that 1% error rate, we're sustainable forever. Nobody has to talk to me. The pager doesn't go off. But if I spike up to 3x and I stay there, and I spike up to 7x, I don't want to wait until the error budget is exhausted. Right? We can see already that the error budget is going to run out and we want to be alerted on that early. So as you move to thinking about your alerting system not being based on triggered from specific alerts or things that have failed previously or other thresholds, instead think about it in the context of how much unreliability did I define was acceptable. And then when we're at risk of violating that level, let's alert on it early. And what's cool about this is you can also set up a way of thinking where instead of paging the team, that alert could be bound to scaling. And SLO-based scaling is one of the coolest scenarios because instead of CPU-based scaling, where there's very low correlation between your service experience, customer bailing on their shopping carts versus your CPU, very low correlation there. With the SLO, the correlation is direct. And so you can look at triggering rollbacks, scale up, load shedding of low priority stuff, feature flagging, so many automated scenarios. And then if I have to, page the team. And even better than that, if I can avoid paging the team and instead file a JIRA, which I'll notice tomorrow, that is another great scenario for error budgets. So it's really about building that automated context and incident response. And then you can still use it for these feature level versus technical debt decisions. So hopefully that illustrates for people how error budgets work with monitoring.
No, that's great, and it really makes me think about this notion of ambulance chasing. When I was CIO, the expectation was, if something's broken, IT has to go run and fix it. If it happens at 3 a.m, I expect it fixed at 3:30 in the morning. And as people get more and more angry about the different types of issues that are facing the operations, it sort of creates this culture that IT always has to go chase the next incident, the next alert, and before you know it, you start burning things out. Can this concept of an error budget be a game changer, Thad? What do you think?
Oh, absolutely. In the ambulance chasing that you mentioned, like you'll find a lot of operations groups are operating in this mode. They're operating in a hero mode, which is flying from incident to incident. And that can sometimes become their identity is, hey, we all jumped on at 3 a.m. Everybody's high-fiving it. And you do that, if that becomes a once a week or once a month activity, you're doing it wrong. And the reality is that ambulance chasing can really burn out your IT team, and it's a detriment to transformation. So one of the side effects of that is you find that your IT teams are disconnected from the customer experience, because from their perspective, it's, hey, if we're up, everything's good, and if we're down, it's bad, right? And that's their tie to the customer, and that's their only sort of vision into that. So, you know, bringing in the reliability conversation and SLOs is the front runner to that culture shift. It gets everyone out of that 5 nines mindset. SLOs really help guide the team on where to focus and air burn downs to help draw attention to the right focus areas, not just flying from incident to incident. So air budgets can be really powerful also for the Agile dev team. So they're already looking at burn down charts. They already know how to read a burn down chart. They read one every week, every 2 weeks, however long your sprint is. Throwing an air budget in there is just the same sort of data visualization that would make a lot of sense to them. So if I had to sum all of that up, I would just say that, you know, when we think about this thing, the SLAs are the CYA, and it may have nothing to do with customers. SLO is that point of excellence for customers. It's granted to you by the customer. So as Kit was describing, it's, hey, what's the point where the customer is going to stay engaged and not make a different choice? And by the way, customer can mean customer paying for something. Customer can also mean internal team member using your service. And really, to bring it back to your point of game changer, once you embrace that concept, it really lets you focus on the strategic aspects of your business, and it helps the organization move forward.
So Kit, tell me how this works in practice. The alerts go off. I got an AI ops solution. It's narrowed it down to an incident, but you know, I'm making my error budget. What am I doing differently now?
Well, I won't comment on the AI ops for a second here, but let's stay in the current phase of technology. One of the things that's happening from an architecture perspective is services, okay, microservices and everything as a service, infrastructure as a service, et cetera. And all of those service boundaries are an opportunity to make assumptions about how things work internally when you interface with it. And so this sort of cascading failure problem where a service depends on another service, depends on another service, with unknown levels or trying their best levels of reliability can be a really big challenge during some sort of outage, right? And by defining SLOs at all layers of the stack, from the sort of the infrastructure layer all the way up to the customer journey, you can start to actually see these meta patterns of service level objectives and where the actual root of the failure is. Now, blamelessness obviously is very important during postmortems, but during an incident, or as an incident is appearing, as we're trying to defend our service from having an incident in the first place, blame is really valuable. Being able to pinpoint and target where we want to respond, whether that's an automated response, you know, where we're going to roll back a release if we're doing progressive deployments, or we're going to scale up the cloud infrastructure, throw money at the problem in a good way, or feature flag, right? All these kinds of automated responses. Or perhaps, you know, getting a team involved. We want to get the right team involved. I mean, it's a big deal to pull a team in if what I call the sort of chain of reliability from the failure to the user, if everybody along that chain gets woken up unnecessarily, that's just adding to pager fatigue. It's adding to frustration for those organizations. It doesn't really help. So that's one of the other benefits of SLOs once you have them really well understood and published, is you almost have an API or a contract between the different service owners and service boundaries.
Sounds great. And Thad, where does automation play into this?
Well, automation is huge in DevOps, in SLO, SRE. But when you think about the front edge of where all these signals are coming through an incident, through, hey, we're having something going on, you can get many discrete signals from many different systems. And one of the things that I love is, and so excited about the Noble 9 platform, is that it really helps to aggregate some of that. And hey, how do these signals help us understand against an SLO? Is it an SLO that, hey, it's my lunch budget and I'm okay? Or have I taken Thad out to lunch and now we really need to alert somebody? So really automating that front end of understanding the signals that are coming in, and then making sure that the response is appropriate and that we can bring in the right teams. So we go to something like status page and let the whole organization know. We go through something like Ops Genie to bring in the right team to help solve the issue. All that orchestration through Jira, all of that can be automated and should be automated, quite frankly. And so, you know, I think there's a huge role on that, and it really starts out at that leading edge of where you get your signals from and how you want to understand those signals.
And Kit, you mentioned that all this really isn't new, that Google has been doing this, that Netflix, Facebook, and Lyft have all been doing this. You know, what bothers me about this is, you know, I don't run a company that looks anything like them. So why is this practice ready for the critical masses?
It's a great question. And if you look at, you know, what's been done in these organizations and what we can learn from them, as we're going through kind of this learning renaissance of taking the techniques and running better software from what's been done in these large internet scale companies. And I think when it comes to the adoption, why now, you know, it comes down to the culture, process, tools, right? The three things that really drive the adoption. From a culture perspective, we're now having these, you know, companies willing to work through the trade-offs. We have business people who understand tech and tech people who understand business, and we're now having better conversations. From a process perspective, you know, DevOps has become a very open-ended kind of conversation. A lot of different things fit into DevOps. I think the reliability engineering gives a very precise kind of set of practices with a very clear business benefit, and that process is really helping, especially when you tie it into the Git Ops, which leads to the tools, right? And so when you think about the tooling, you know, a lot of those organizations built it themselves. That's not the way that most software teams are working now. And this is why we built an SLO platform, was to remove all of that infrastructure burden so people can focus on what they're doing. We removed the math, we removed all the integration points, we removed all the kind of plumbing and piping. And that's what people are expecting. And that's the case across the whole dev tool stack. It's true with the Atlassian tools, CI/CD tools, source control. This stuff used to be built in-house. Now smaller organizations can become more nimble, more agile, because they're benefiting from things out there. So I think it really comes down to those things. And people are pretty frustrated right now as we've gone through COVID and they've seen their life become digitally dependent. With the great reopening we're going through next, I don't think anybody's going back to putting up with low quality video streaming or food delivery or anything else. So the expectations continue, and we gotta deliver our software at the level that everyone expects. Why not learn from the best practices out there?
Super, Kit, thanks. That brings us to really our fifth point, and it's really about thinking about how to use error budgets and SLOs to really bring that upstream into our development process and starting to think differently about how we're managing our backlog, really about that incident defense that we talked about at the start of the of this webinar. So, you know, Kit, bring me back to this. You know, I'm an agile team. I really like feedback. You know, how does an error budget influence the product owner?
The error budget is a perfect kind of feedback for this kind of development, because our consumption or remainder of error budget after a given period, whether that's, you know, monthly, quarterly, et cetera, will help us decide what goes in scope in the next sprint. And so, you know, you have a feature. I used to be a product manager, and I remember very clearly asking for every feature I could get. And the engineering team really wants to make sure they pay down their technical debt. That conflict is a negotiation. How do we move that from a negotiation into a collaboration? And error budget becomes the answer. We owe it to our customers to spend our error budget wisely. Let's agree on what that is in our current context. If we have error budget left over, that means that we can move faster, we can work on features. If we have spent all the error budget and gone under, that means that our reliability needs some investment. And that is something we can all kind of agree on, as opposed to fighting over the improvements. And also, if you're doing a large move, hey, we want to replatform everything to Kubernetes. We want to move everything to cloud. We want to add service mesh. Does it pencil out? If you can say that's going to give me an extra 9 of reliability, and you don't need it, it may be hard to justify that reliability project. So this gets to really having better decision-making, better conversations, better feedback loops between the business stakeholders and the technical stakeholders who have more work than they can ever do.
Super. And that, let's talk about how to implement that in Atlassian's tools. I have Jira software for my dev teams. I have JSM for my ops teams. We're using Confluence. How do we create that feedback there?
Yeah, no, I think it's important. It's something we touched on early too. It's just, you know, having this one platform where all your teams are really working in. So you mentioned the various teams and the various stack of the Atlassian tool chain. So we have, you know, we have those ops teams working out of JSM. We have dev teams working out of Jira. And really, when you start to think about it, Jira is our hub of processes. So if we say, hey, you know, let's agree that the work we're going to do is going to be represented in Jira. And how do we connect that to all the other tools in our tool chain to make sure that I can go to Jira and figure out where we are on any given piece of work that we're doing. And then on the other flip side is Confluence is really that hub of knowledge. So if I think about, hey, great, this is the work that's happening, but why did we make this decision? Why did we decide to build this? Why are we going after these initiatives? That a lot of that why is rooted right in Confluence. And then there's, the operational pieces in Confluence. Hey, how do I do certain things are built in Confluence? But it really becomes our hub of knowledge. And so, if you carry that forward to incidents and root cause analysis, you can really see that, hey, if the entire org is using this platform, you can really start to connect the dots in a powerful way. What are the frontline customer teams seeing? Well, we can see that through JSM. What are our, how does that tie back to the features that were built in deploy? Okay, I can see what happened there. How does that tie back to the QA teams? How does that all decide and fall back to our feature roadmap? And so it really is this powerful hub of information and knowledge that really connects all the dots. And then you start thinking about, okay, great operationally, then how do I start to move forward and look forward at a bigger scale picture? And then you look at things like advanced roadmaps for Jira or Jira Align, where you're talking about, great, how do I make sure the whole organization is moving in the same direction and getting that alignment? And you can do that in the same tools that all the way comes back down to an incident happened. And so it's really about connecting all of those dots and seeing a complete story there.
Super. This has been a great conversation. We're going to get to everybody's questions now. Before we get there, I want to leave everybody with some best practices that you've heard today. The 5 things to take away. Number 1, make sure to define the SRE role in your organization. Use that function to define service level objectives and use business context as a key way of defining the differences in how you of the mindset between going from an SLA to an SLO mindset. Then you could start realigning your operations to start working with things like air budgets and burn downs, and then moving that information upstream around how to shift to experiences. And then lastly, it's really about prioritizing differently, right? It's not just what the product owner wants from a business value perspective. We're now equating the air budget into that equation and using that to prioritize our backlogs. So Kit and Thad, thank you for all that great detail. I want to tell you a little bit more about something Kit and Noble 9 are offering. They're offering a half-day awesome SLO boot camp. As much as we've simplified the discussion to SLOs, I think it still takes some mindset shift and some learning about how to instrument them. Kit, I really hope to take advantage of one of these days with some of my clients. But here you'll hear more about this around the SLO boot camp. And again, you'll be getting all these slides at the end, so you'll be able to get to that URL, isostech.com/noble9-SLO-bootcamp if you want to take advantage of this offer. Lastly, around service level management, please join us next week at the Atlassian webinar on high velocity service management. That's March 23rd at 11 a.m. You can get there through the isostech.com/Atlassian-gov-webinar. And then again, download the white paper from ISOStech on Jira Service Management. You can get that at isostech.com/JSM-whitepaper. So with that, I think we're ready for some questions. We have a bunch of them here. The first one is actually coming from Doug, who's somebody I used to work with. He used to be my head of operations about a decade ago. So Doug, thank you for joining us. And I love this question about SLO for applications versus infrastructure. How do you break this down for the app owners? I think, Kit, there's 2 questions here around. First is this the right way to think about it? Is there an SLO for application and a separate one for infrastructure? And then talk about, now you have the full stack application infrastructure. How do you have that conversation with the app owner to get an answer around that?
Yeah, it's a great point. So anything that can be defined as a service can have a service level, and there are some other questions about like good SLOs and things. So I'll try to touch on some of this. We'll come back to it. But basically, what you want to define in the SLO is what matters to the consumer of that service. And usually we think about this at the next tier. So if I'm building infrastructure, it's going to be the apps that depend on my infrastructure is where I want to define SLOs. And so you might have things around availability and latency. If you're building not a web application, but maybe a data processing pipeline, you might care about throughput. You might care about freshness if you're building a cache. There are different kinds of things. But fundamentally, the idea, as my CTO loves to say, is like, get everything down to a beautiful fraction of 1. And it makes everything comparable. And if you can find that that correct sort of fraction that represents customer happiness, then you have this sort of common language, whether it's app or infrastructure. And one of the common SLOs that I hear about a lot that kind of touches these things, password reset SLO. This is an interesting one. Every app has some sort of password reset. So how do we measure the success of that password reset, which is usually a call driver, a customer satisfaction driver? If people are completing it within a certain time frame, 99.99 or 99.9% of the time, your customers are probably happy. And there are lots more examples we can do. And I would tell you, every organization is different and needs different SLOs. That's why the boot camp is so important. But anyway, that hopefully answers your question about the app versus infra.
Isaac, could I just add just a
Please, go ahead.
on that too? I love it. And I just want to say, like, for me, and Kit, I think you said this, but I just want to reemphasize it because it's such an important point. Like, if you're thinking down at that level, I think you're looking too much at how the sausage is being made. Flip this conversation, think about it from a customer's perspective. They don't care that like a password reset hits these 3 systems, hits this infrastructure, and hits, they don't care. All they care about is their experience. So start thinking about it from a user experience perspective, and then you tie in the 7 different systems that make up that SLO, but you're really talking about it from a customer experience perspective.
And if you can anthropomorphize, is what I like to do, your users. If you're really building infrastructure, if you're building, like, I run the Kubernetes cluster and I'm a cluster admin, what are my cluster SLOs? You might care about pod spin up, right? You might care about VM joining, host joining, right? Like, there are things that you could care about for network and other things like that, that the customer is the application, right? And so in those cases, you want to do that. But I do definitely agree with you, Thad, like getting people to think about that real end customer impact and removing the implementation, right, of all the systems you need in order to run it is super important for SLOs.
Yeah, I'm just also thinking, Kit, around this is you broke down and about how granular we should get our SLOs. And if I'm running an infrastructure group, I'm running the cloud group, for example, and we're trying to get to a granular SLO, I'm going to think of maybe the application owner as my customer, or not necessarily upstream as the end user. Exactly. And you brought up an example when we talked about if the DR server is down, right? Should I go chasing that problem if customers aren't impacting about that? So I think that's the nature of the question. There's a follow-up question here. Someone else asked, what are some good example of SLOs when we should think about this?
Yeah, so it's really, I kind of keep beating this. It's like, what matters to your customers, it matters. One question, like if you're in a bank, mobile check upload is one I've talked about a lot. How many, and again, how do you pose it to the business? How many out of the 1,000 people that do a mobile check upload can you have a 30% degradation in performance and not page someone? Like, at what point will they break and not upload the check and have to go drive into the bank or switch to a different bank, right? This is where you find it, or tweet about it. Whatever your business is, figure out what those critical points are that frustrate them. Go look at your social media and figure out what people are complaining about on social media and put SLOs on that. That's what I would probably look at first. And there's examples all over the place. And by the way, if you go to the Noble 9 blog, we have lots of resources on these topics too.
Yeah, Kit, I love that answer. Don't reinvent the wheel. I mean, I see a lot of my clients trying to come up with their metrics on their own. That's what all of us do, is try to give them for you and say, here are some of the best practices around that. So if you don't know the answer to that, reach out to Kit, reach out to Thad, reach out to me, and we're absolutely happy to help you understand KPIs, metrics, and things like that. But Doug asked a good question here, and as a follow-up, in terms of like sequencing the maturity, right? You're bringing SREs in, you're starting to look at how to put the defense in place, you're starting to put SLOs in place. At what point do you start thinking about using and either measuring and then using error budgets?
Well, Thad wants to answer. Go.
Go ahead, Dad.
Kit's the expert, but I feel like I know this one. And it's don't wait, early and often, and feedback is good. This is coming back to that. Hey, we're going to iterate. We have an agile mindset. Let's put something out there, and it could be ridiculous. It could be ridiculously low or ridiculously high, but we're putting a stake in the ground, and we're going to measure, monitor, and we're going to manage to and try to get better at it. And that's, again, I'll do the pitch because I know Kit doesn't want to, but that's exactly why their platform is so great is, hey, let's put that stake in the ground and let's just start to see. And what you might find in 2 or 3 months is, hey, we're really measuring the wrong thing. Let's go. And this isn't a, hey, we've settled it and now we're going to just sit and watch these things for the next 3 years, right? This is an evolving thing. So just get in your mindset that, hey, we're not going to have it all figured out right away, but we're going to put some stakes in the ground and we're going to have a discipline around improvement.
Well said, Thad. I want to just add one point. The sneaky thing about error budgets is that they're implied by the SLO. And so if you just start by setting an SLO, you actually already have error budgets. They only become budgets when you start thinking differently about what they mean. And so if previously, you said some goal and you said, oh, we beat the SLA, we're good, right? Or you had somebody on your team hide an outage to meet the SLA so you wouldn't get sued. But if you beat the SLA and you're good, the question is like, well, how much higher than the SLA did I go? Well, you're not answering that question. You're saying if we at least beat the SLA, then we're good. The SLO is saying, try to hit this target precisely. Don't hit above the SLA as much as possible, hit a specific SLO. And then you can evolve into the error budget thinking and start using it for these other decision makings. Just as Thad said, create that feedback loop. That's the super important part.
Super. And so Thad, I think we're going to end with this question with you. And I love this question because you came up with this minimally viable excellence. Thank you. Minimally viable excellence is a way of thinking about, creating your service levels. And some, there's an anonymous question here, trying to compare that to the MVP, minimal viable product, versus the MDP, the minimal delightable product. So if your product is just viable, it might be so what. You really need to stretch it to that next point where it's delightable, and then you're going to have happy end users. How do we think about that in terms of service level objectives and this idea of minimal viable excellence?
Well, I think they're really kind of different legs of the same stool. So you think about what you're building, and so minimal viable product is, hey, what can I put out there from a feature set that my customers are going to use? Okay, I get that. Minimal delightful product. So now we're taking that to the next level. And then when I'd say minimal viable excellence or edge of excellence, that's a pretty catchy term too. I might change that one. We're really thinking about from an operational standpoint. So how reliable is this product? People might love it. It might be delightable. It might just be a minimum viable project that they're using, but what's their expectation of availability of that product before they're fed up? They might love it, but if it's not reliable enough for them, they won't use it. So it's really about adding in another component to another dimension to that dynamic on where you want to be from your product stance. I think it's a really important thing to consider. And, so often people think about things in, again, they fall back into that 5 nines, 6 nines, right? And it's like, that's the end of their conversation. That's where their brain shuts off. And it's like, okay, let's actually have an honest discussion about reliability and what it means on that front.
Thanks, Thad and Kit. We are really up against the final hour here. Again, you will get the slides by email. You will get access to the recording by email. There are a couple questions there I don't think that we got answers to. Please go to the ISOS Technology blog. I'm told that we will get an answer up there in short time off of this. I want to thank Thad from ISOS Technology, Kit from Noble 9. I'm Isaac Sacolick from StarCIO. Thank you for joining for this webinar, and stay tuned again for your answers, for access, and for learning more about how to make SREs work in your organization. Have a great day.